Welcome to Searching for the Question Live. My name is David Orban, and I am very glad to have you on the show. We are streaming live on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. And on YouTube, I invite you to become a subscriber so that you can be alerted when we go live next. And of course, you can also watch on all the platforms the recordings of the previous shows on various topics that are concerning technology, how it impacts society, with people from all over the world, really, which is the beauty of our technology today that enables us to connect. For me, Searching for the Question Live is a pleasure of meeting old friends and new friends and catch up with them. What are the projects that they are passionate about and how they are coping with the pandemic, and how they believe the future of the world will be shaped by this event, and certainly others that we still have ahead of us. The beauty of being live is also that you can comment, ask questions, and if they are relevant, I will be happy to pull them in the stream, and together with the guest, we will answer it and create the kind of interactivity that really matters today. We also have a community of conversations where you can join and continue debating the implications of the themes that we are addressing. Come to davidorban.com/discord. You can also propose who should be the guest and vote on those that have been proposed by others. And if you like the content that together with my team I create, you are welcome to be a fan, a supporter, a sponsor, or a benefactor on Patreon at patreon.com/davidorban. Today's guest is Marc Winn from Guernsey in the Channel Islands. And those of you who watch Searching for the Question Live frequently know that I like to show where things are on the planet as well. So we will definitely go and check out where Guernsey is, because the first time that I heard about it, I for sure didn't know. And Marc has been very kind, invited me to a TEDx conference he organized at St. Peter Port on Guernsey, and gave me the opportunity to really get to know this very interesting community. We will talk about it. I have, for some reason, an affinity with micronations and these interesting small communities that nonetheless have proven through the centuries to have a staying power and ability to adapt to the new realities. So this looks like almost a series. One of the previous episodes, you can go and check it out, was actually with a specific foundation that looks at encouraging the institution of special economic zones that these micronations naturally are, to experiment with new things that are possible. So let's talk about this as well as about other things with Marc while he's having a coffee. Hello, Marc.
Good morning, everyone.
Welcome to Searching for the Question Live. I realize I forgot my cup. I'm guilty. So it is very nice, because that is how you reach out on your newsletter to the people who read it. Do you want us to have a coffee? And sometimes that is a physical coffee, but other times it is like this, a digital coffee.
Yep.
Still wonderful. And I guess that is a way for you to catch up with people, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's also to catch up with people, but I find it also as one of the primary mechanisms to make change happen. So it's an ancient technology, but it if you think about persuasion, when you're trying to persuade whole systems, then usually there's a single point of weakness or strength in a system that one can copy with to persuade a system to shift. So
and do you think that having a cup of coffee in the morning is a better mechanism to accelerate change rather than having a pint in the afternoon or the evening?
Certainly if you're a father of 3 children. Yes, so I would say I would develop significant. I mean, beer is good as well, but the retention of the conversation content often doesn't. So I found as someone who in my youth was an expert using beer, and I found for social change hyper attention in a high trust environment, which the traditional meeting would not be a high trust environment, whereas a coffee where one-on-one is a high trust, open-hearted, connected environment, as a beer would be, but where the prospect of retention is high, then coffee works.
Is it fair to say that one has to be cautious in articulating explicitly the mechanisms of creating trust? Otherwise, the other party may take it as something that you do in order to unduly gain that trust, right? What is the right balance? Because, of course, I am always in favor of transparency and openness, but there is a little bit of a contradiction. If I know that you are using those tools on purpose, then I may raise artificially my barriers because I don't want to fall prey of the tricks that you are deploying.
Yeah, I mean, I think it really, I mean, there are some people that use it deliberately. I think the most important thing in a conversation that builds trust is to separate yourself from any desire for outcome. And I think the thing, in 6,000 coffees in the last 6 years in my community, if you're trying to manipulate a situation, then people can smell this, So ultimately, it's about using the time to deepen relationship and to get to know someone and to find out what their story is, what they're passionate about, where they're trying to get to in life. And meaning that's really a kind of data gathering exercise, and then it's how can myself as an individual and all the people I'm connected to support that person to achieve the outcomes that they're trying to achieve.
Coffee is the tool that can facilitate the outcome of a genuine connection and an honest desire to achieve a common goal.
Yeah,
as it is often the case with tools that can improve a situation, but they cannot counter something that is starting on the wrong foot anyway.
Yeah, totally.
You couldn't sway an enemy. You can reinforce a friend's commitment.
Well, I mean, it takes two people to create conflict. So even I would say
Unless,
you can
unless you're schizophrenic, and then you're very good at creating conflict
yes,
on your own too, when
quite.
you're alone.
Quite. So I have very few enemies because I'm not looking for any, right? And so
That's fair.
yeah.
So as I said at the beginning, let's take a look. This is Bergamo, where I am right now.
Which looks beautiful.
It is. You should come if you haven't been. It is right at the beginning of the Alps in northern Italy, on the confluence of two rivers, as it is often the case. And here in the hills, there have been people living in one way or another since the Neolithic, and
Wow.
it's really very nice.
Beautiful.
And you are here, which is not too far, but very well hidden. I had no idea. Even that these islands. I mean, I heard the expression Channel Islands, but it could have been anything, right? And so this is Guernsey. I think it's better to keep giving some context. All right.
Yeah.
So you are closer to France than England and Wales, which are these two things here. And of course the UK as a whole, and Great Britain, which themselves are pretty confusing terms. And there is a whole chart. I think UK, England, Great Britain, and if we look at the images,
Yeah.
these charts are good, and there should be some that also show Channel Islands. There you go.
Yeah. So we're part of the British Isles, but not part of Britain or the UK. So
yes.
Which, from a governance perspective, is very interesting.
And so Guernsey, Jersey, and they forgot the Isle of Man over here.
Well, Isle of Man is in between Ireland and England. It's
geographically it's somewhere else.
Yeah.
All right. Okay. So was Guernsey always independent to the point as it is now, or has that been achieved more recently?
I mean, it was part of Normandy in 1066 and William the Conqueror type thing, and then when William the Conqueror took over the UK, then that was when Normandy became part of that empire, and so its roots, I think, mostly lie in that era, and then it's been handed over between England and France at various times. It was the only part of the British Isles occupied in the Channel Islands were the only part of the British Isles occupied in the Second World War.
Oh wow!
And so there's this kind of heritage of being an asset to be swapped around, but it's also had its independence, history of privateering and using loopholes, from sugar tax era to now financial services to it's always found its way of operating in its isolation, in a way to gain leverage, as many small micronations have done over the years. They find themselves a little way of making a living and operate that way, but in this hyper-connected world, that opens up a whole new level of possibility.
Absolutely. I have had contact with Malta, with Andorra, with other micronations, and it is always very interesting to look at the history, as I said, of adaptation and adaptability, and an ability to navigate among the giants, and to necessarily find weird and ingenious ways to survive and to create value.
Yeah.
And you are a Guernsey native.
So it depends which way you look at it. I was born here and raised here, but my parents are English, and so
Okay.
kind of the true natives would not see me as a Guernsey native, but I'm because you have to, like, you know,
go back 5
generations of cousins,
yeah.
and things like that. But I count myself as from here,
and you really define Guernsey as your home.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, I've lived off island maybe 25% of my life, for various reasons, and but ultimately this is where I'm from. This is where my kids are growing up. This is
how old are they?
9, 4, and 2. It's chaos.
Wow.
Driving lockdown with that chaos, it was intense.
So tell me, how was it with the pandemic in Guernsey, and how is it now?
So it was, you know, scary in the beginning. What you have is a hyper-connected society, where a lot of people were skiing, and so we got hit very quickly from people coming back from ski resorts where, you know, particularly North Italy, you know, the Alps was like an incubator. So we managed to adapt pretty quickly. So we had maybe 250 cases in total. We sadly lost 16 lives, but we had the capacity as an island to close our borders, and to adapt very quickly. But we only have a very small health system, so we had to really move. But I think in that we're highly socially cohesive community, so we followed public health advice. So we got, you know, we crashed the curve. We eliminated COVID totally, and so we've spent we haven't had a case for over 2 months, and we are in this strange kind of paradise bubble where there's literally no restrictions anymore.
You did have, though, a complete lockdown for a given period of time, right?
Yeah. So we luckily, our head of public health is a virologist, so
it helps.
We just literally had the best person in charge. We developed this kind of wartime governance system where a very small number of people made rapid decisions, and we, you know, we managed to build a second ICU in like weeks. You know, we had a lot of planning and things like that, centralized planning, but planning nonetheless. And the population, there was this thing called Guernsey Together emerged, where the population just decentralized the response and looked after all the old people, built systems, built infrastructure, and with this beautiful symbiosis between the people and government to do what was necessary to completely eliminate the virus, but also support everyone and who's at home alone. And so that we, you know, could have been a lot worse, but ultimately we managed to completely eliminate everything and then restart the economy from a place.
And you told me you went to a concert yesterday.
Yeah, no. So I was in one of the neighboring islands called Herm, which is this beautiful paradise island. About 50 people live on it, and there was a concert, and so you have hundreds of people in a small space, all hugging each other, and which you'd take for granted before COVID, but we must be one of the few places in the world where that's both allowed and safe.
Wow.
So we live. Yeah, everyone in this community is like so phenomenally grateful right now, because they recognize we have literally no restrictions. So to being, something I take for granted, for something like that I take for granted, which is hugging everyone I meet.
Yeah,
that's perfectly allowed.
And that is wonderful, as long as you don't allow anybody in. Well,
yeah, I mean, we have 14-day quarantine.
Okay.
Currently, big track and trace system. So, but that quarantine system is built on trust. So there's no being sent into hotels or anything. It's like that.
Okay, so you arrive, you go to the hotel or Airbnb
or your house
or a private house, and then you are supposed to be there, but it's not that the constable or whoever it is shows up every day to check on you.
Yeah, I mean, this is what I said. We've got really high social cohesion, and so
that also implies that if I were to disobey the quarantine and just would go out and about, somebody would drop a call to somebody else saying, "Hey, this guy's really not doing the right thing."
Yeah, high transparency, right? Yeah. So that's the great thing about small micronations is that enough people, it's self-regulating, and because you can't, everyone is 1 or 2 steps removed from each other. So we know if someone's just arrived on a plane.
What is the population of Guernsey?
So it's 63,000.
63,000, like
small town, yeah.
Small town, yeah. And when I came, when you organized St. Peter Port, you felt that everything was going fine, but it could go even much better. And you wanted the Guernsey government to really embrace a lot of the innovation, both organizational and technological, that would allow Guernsey in the 21st century to flourish, as well as the people of Guernsey. I also met the government, a group of ministers at the time, and then elections came and whatever else. So as far as whatever you and I had in mind that I could help contributing didn't happen. But since then, how did your thinking evolve? What was it at the time? What is it now? How do you think it is going to be in a few years' time?
Well, I mean, the genesis of the thinking in terms of why I do what I do comes from a place that you and many other people know, which is Singularity University, and what I remember the conversation that happened in 2013, which was which by the end of the decade, a kid in their bedroom will be able to create a killer virus. And I didn't sleep for 7 days, I recall, when I first had that conversation, and it was really about, and then something I'm passionate about, which is direct marketing, and what I understood was this algorithmic destruction that was coming in terms of mass manipulation. I'm a marketer and I've been using subconscious manipulation, and so what I saw was this perfect storm of wave after wave of disruption that large governance systems could not adapt to. So populism, biological disruption, the very era that we're living in now. And I saw that actually we're going to have to transition to a radically different form of governance, and that genuinely the only place that was possible was in these small micro nations, and that the Googles and Facebooks of collective organization, or collective self-governance, as I call it, would emerge from these small systems. So that was the theory, and then you realize you can't use fear as the mechanism so you can't talk about chaos and damnation, because it just seems like a crazy person. You have to try and use social cohesion, because one of the key things that I got that time is that in this new world you can't leave anyone behind, because one person can create a virus or can create something and create exponential systemic risks. So you have to innovate from the perspective of not disrupting, which is the Silicon Valley mindset, is winner takes all, one disrupts the other. But when you think about chaos, it's one individual disaffection is what drives global chaos. And so you're left with this: how do you build a new social construct or a new form of governance where no one gets left behind? And when you realize these small systems are actually very fearful of change and fearful of all of this stuff that's happening in the world, and so there's the real challenge is, how do you capitalize on all of this possibility when people are fundamentally afraid of change.
And that is what gave birth to the Dandelion Foundation.
Yeah,
right?
which is how do we shift the consciousness of a system almost to allow and decode fear of a system to allow it to become a platform for progress. And when you start to understand what is it that decodes fear, it's community and connection and well-being and all these thriving states. And so, we set out the mission to make Guernsey the best place to live on earth, which now is mischievously part of our national governance, to make Guernsey one of the happiest and healthiest countries in the world. But the secret to that is happy, healthy, social, cohesive communities can adapt to change faster. So you have to start to consider about how, and in this era of chaos and disruption, the countries with the biggest social problems are the ones that are finding it hardest to adapt to COVID. And this dynamic is going to expand wave after wave of disruption that we're going to have this decade, is the less that you can only move at the pace of your biggest social problem. And we're seeing it in different countries in different ways. So in ours, it was the care homes, because we outsourced the looking after old people. If you look at something like Singapore, it's the labor camps. If you look at somewhere like Italy, it's the gross ignoring of governance. Every system has its own. Or you look at the US, and it's big social cohesion, individualism, and the UK as well. And so you're seeing this disruption highlighting and showing the mirror to every community, every jurisdiction, and anybody that's been left behind basically is ignoring the state. And the more you ignore public health advice, and the harder it is to recover economically. And so you end up in this strange symbiosis where social progress and economic progress are becoming massively convergent. And so it's interesting to say, how do you and the response actually in our system is the bulk of the response was delivered by the community. We're in symbiosis with public health, and love for government has gone up massively, and all of these things have gone massively. But there's a cohesion process that's been going on here, and so we will have to realize that to navigate the future, we have to build tribe and connection, and rather than many of the stuff that we've been doing individually has been creating separation, individualism, personal want, all of this kind of stuff. And actually, to navigate chaos, you need the opposite. And so there's a shift we have to navigate back to, because we've got this primal monkey mind that's being manipulated, which is a very ancient technology that's designed for a very different environment, meeting this highly complex system of manipulation, and with the tools that we're able to infinitely leverage to cause good or bad. And as we all know, we have got light and shade within ourselves, and so it's how do our systems get the best out of us, rather than at the moment when many of our systems treat us like a criminal by default, or zero trust as by default. So we get disengagement from our systems. And so the challenge is how do we decode our way back to each other, system scale, so that we can adapt and operate in a very different future model of governance. And we have big issues to collaborate on, like climate change, and we have to find a model of human thriving for 10 billion people in the next few years that delivers radically higher social progress within planetary boundaries. That is a completely different model of governance, right? And how do we let go of this individualism, or see individualism as collectivism? How do we find a very different way to interact as individuals, or a wiser way to interact as individuals, to allow us to move to the future and deliver a form of governance where everybody thrives and no one gets left behind, and everybody creates space for each other, and everybody works together to raise our kids together, to look after our old people together, to be in community together, on a planet, in combination of nature and things like that. So there's a massive. So I talk a lot about the democratization of wisdom. And we've seen the democratization of knowledge. We're in the era of the democratization of intelligence, and we're getting some very smart people doing some very stupid things. And And what we need for our very survival is a democratization of wisdom, which is the question for this is, why on earth are we doing what we do? Why are we earning so much money to pay for stuff we don't need, doing stuff we don't love, right? And so wisdom and technology, there's a merging together of these questions, which is, there's a lot of energy we've created in the world, and lockdown really tuned us into this, right? Is much of our life we were on a hamster wheel or a hedonic treadmill, and we're like, how have we got so lost? And so we have some real deep questions to ask about the kind of humanity that wants to emerge in the next decade, and all of these chaos, of which COVID is a good first wave, are going to get us to ask deeper questions about ourselves and what type of life we want to live. And then our governance and our systems and the way we organize has to evolve with that new, deeper wisdom that's emerging or surfacing, because we have to, for our very survival, get very wise very quickly.
So Dandelion set itself up with this mission, and then Guernsey is potentially the first environment where to take steps in order to implement it, including that, yes, you can have a lot of bottom-up adoption, but sooner or later you need buy-in from the government or from whatever regulatory bodies that can sanction the kind of new organization or enhance its ability to achieve impact. So how did you find that to be working out, especially from the top down?
Yeah, well, and I always say leaders are a representation of the population. So you get the government you are, and understanding that community members work for government, community members get elected. It's like governments aren't this nebulous, disconnected kind of non-human thing. They're people like you and me that live in the same spaces as me, and as their perceptions of the world shift, then policy shifts and everything shifts. So I see government as a byproduct of community. And so I don't actually have to really focus on the hierarchy, focus on the, I really focus on cultural transformation of community, trusting that governance shifts as community cultures shift. And so really much of my work is like a weaving process, which is weaving people to each other, and focusing on the social fabric and social culture, and culture eats strategy for breakfast, as they say. And so how do you start to develop a more compassionate, more progressive individual culture, and so how do you start to develop systems of perspective, narratives of unity, all of these kind of things, and you can gradually cultivate that over the long period of time. In the same way that, algorithmically people are manipulating votes with, narratives and perspectives and things like that. You can use the same tools to bring community together. Just in micronations, you can use this. In large nations, you have to use algorithms and Facebook and scale. But ultimately, the narratives come, and the deep understanding of people come from this, and the scaling. Comes from, and so it'll be interesting is what are the new perspectives that emerge in these small nations. And it won't just be Guernsey, it'll be after COVID, you'll see a group of places, a bit like the blue zones in longevity. You'll see a group of communities that came back so quickly from COVID and actually came back better than before. And when we start to study them, we will understand that social cohesion, or some part of community being close, was what was the key factor in driving transformation through chaos, and that some of those communities would have had it as part of their DNA, of the fabric of that culture or community, but others would have had this deliberate community building process going on. And so we'll start to realize that to get transformation in organizations or in governments or communities, that having a weaving process, a social fabric process, a deliberate, intentional, invested in process that brings community close together will accelerate transition to the future. And we'll start to look at scaling that.
As you describe it, it becomes evident that an explicit, proactive, intentional educational and learning process is key to this as well.
Yeah.
Whether in the school system or in the family or in the public square, as these possibilities are debated and realized and adopted by individuals and groups. And in that sense, the process itself is also a test of the viability and the attractiveness of the ideas that survive because they are illustrating a future that is full of possibility and open to opportunity. And as a consequence, people who buy into the set of ideas feel those opening up to them. And feel more empowered and more emancipated than those who reject them for one reason or another. What is the challenge of the equivalent process that we mentioned before? Somebody in Guernsey already can take advantage of the environment being COVID-free, but as soon as you open up, you have to manage the process via the 2-week quarantine or whatever else may be in the future. The equivalent from the point of view of regulations and belonging to a larger community of countries, Guernsey cannot be seeing itself as isolated anymore. Otherwise, it would still go around marauding in pirate ships because it is a pretty easy and fun way to make a living. But it doesn't. It has adopted a lot of things, many of them voluntarily, some of them less so, that make it part of a system. So Guernsey itself cannot be too far ahead of the group, right? How can that process be handled? How is it possible to point out some of the shortcomings of, I don't know, an international treaty that has been adopted, but it's still the result of consensus and compromise, and if you or Guernsey have a better solution, a better system, well, it will take a long time before that is realized, adopted, and implemented. And in the meantime, Guernsey is subject to the imperfect version thorough.
Well, I mean, if you think about it in quality of life terms, it's like you don't need permission as a community to increase the quality of life for your neighbors, right? And so in some ways, governance counts a lot less than we think in terms of delivering economic progress and social progress. So it's like, for me, it's around, you can actually progress a lot without government and without in the loopholes where the treaty and with these treaties and things like that don't exist. But it requires generosity. It requires, all of these skills that aren't included within the frameworks, kindness, love, compassion. These things can be amplified and developed outside of the rules, right? Because the rules don't make them. And so you can actually go quite a distance without, in terms of proving quality of life, what matters to people, without necessarily needing governance to or collective agreement that we can be kind. We don't need a global agreement to be kind to our neighbors. We don't need a global agreement to grow food locally. We don't need a global agreement to do our own power. And
let's look at those two examples. I remember almost 10 years ago, it was very significant to me that at the time Guernsey was beholden to a steady supply of gasoline from France, if I'm not mistaken.
Mhm.
And that to me represented a dependency
Yeah.
that could put
Mhm.
that could imperil
Mhm.
the ambitions of
Yeah.
a more courageous, independent thinking.
Mhm.
And one of my recommendations was go solar as soon as you can. And now we have wonderful solutions, both at the level of individual houses, but also at the level of larger communities,
Yeah.
where solar plants coupled with batteries can represent total independence for energy. What has or hasn't happened in the meantime towards that?
Yeah, so all of the frameworks that allow that to happen are emerging. They've just recently been voted on and things like that. So part of it is, and then obviously the narrative around resilience in this COVID world has suddenly become front and center. So
Yep.
our recovery strategy is very much focused on thriving and resilience and building this kind of new waves of infrastructure. And our strategy as a finance community is to finance the global transition. So we're one of the world's first green finance funds, and realize that we need. So what I see is the radical decentralization of infrastructure, right? That's happening. And localization of, and so part of the conflict in the world and all of the challenge in the world is happening primarily because we need to collaborate at large scale to deliver infrastructure. Whereas what's emerging now is the hyper-localization of infrastructure. So dependency, so the dependency required is dropping all the time as each new wave of infrastructure arrives in a decentralized way. And so suddenly the need for large countries disappears, because if you think about it, large countries are really collaborating at a scale big enough to deliver infrastructure, be it an army or but in a more decentralized world, the need for a large nation state exists. So our dependencies, each new form of infrastructure hits a price point, Guernsey can adopt it very quickly, and its dependency on the outside world drops. And there's a ratio, a kind of size that islands become viable on their own, is as each new infrastructure decentralizes, the minimum viable kind of size for islands changes, because we've got our own health infrastructure, we've got our own we've got our own a full working government, we've got everything, and we deliver that cheaper than the rest of the world can deliver it. So we deliver governance at 20% of GDP, whereas the UK would deliver governance at 38% of GDP. Now our quality of life is higher, and as each new infrastructure decentralizes, that gets easier and easier. So as energy decentralizes, as transport decentralizes, as all of the current barriers to living on an island, which you described, we import our oil, which creates, as we become more resilient, as all of these new technological opportunities, then the need for large nation states disappears. And so if community...
Tesla recently announced that they have, or rather, Elon Musk tweeted that they have achieved level 5 autonomy in self-driving cars, which means you don't need to pay attention anymore, and
on American roads.
Well, and now he says we need to take care of the edge cases, and of course, where the edges are, and what are the quirks of driving in India, for example,
or
as
here.
opposed to America, are not irrelevant. And then deployment will follow the regulatory frameworks, where making these cars available in any way is permitted. Do you think that that Guernsey, in that sense, can spearhead some experiments, or it should rather follow?
Well, it's already been doing it, right? In terms of the reason why Guernsey is so wealthy is because of governance innovation in finance to allow innovative new financial products to take off, because you can have a coffee-based relationship with a financial regulator. You can have this dialogue. So in some ways, we've got better financial regulation than most places in the world, but the capacity to innovate, because you don't have to go to some massive department and through 10 layers of things. You can have coffee with the regulator, and now we're increasingly using that platform, as we've done in COVID. We developed our own framework, our own governance, our own regulation, much faster than larger countries, and that's now being studied by larger countries. Say and that's becoming an export. So we realized that this idea of testbed nation, and so, the real theme that I want to get across to the world is there are dozens of these micronations around the world, and there's a lot of people putting a lot of money into innovation in big systems, where they would make a lot more progress if they moved that innovation out to the edges and out to the governance to de-risk situations, to understand and so all of the waves of driverless, and so it really, for me, it's about find the right jurisdiction that is open, or the right timing, has the right challenges to testbed those solutions. Now Guernsey seems to be innovating around health in particular, and a real focus on healthcare governance, because it's our biggest cost. We have an aging population. We're going to have to do things differently and so the incentive is for us to try new things in health. Each jurisdiction has its own challenges because of its scale and its size and things like that. And so it's really around what I saw in Silicon Valley when I was there was all of this innovation coming through, many of the solutions blocked by governance and regulation in some ways. And my thing is saying Silicon Valley may have the ecosystem from an innovation point of view, but does not have the ecosystem from a governance point of view. And so one has to look at all of the governance zones around the world, and then start to gamify governance transformation by finding the right jurisdiction that can create the right breakthroughs in the right way, to allow these technologies that cross silo in governance forms. So with driverless, there's insurance challenges, there's interaction with public challenges, there's re-ownership, there's fuel system challenge. There's a lot of complexity that impacts a lot of industries and a lot of governance frameworks, that is best done in a jurisdiction where you can sandbox new regulation and interact with the law, but recognizing that some jurisdictions are democracies. And so I actually think it's the narrative testing that is the most important thing with new technology, which is how do you go in to a community and de-fear driverless cars, right? And then look at the relationship between governance and fear. Because a lot of people will go to Ireland and say, I want a red carpet, and then get rejected by the community, and not understanding that the point of going to a small community is to work on the narratives to scale a new technology.
Yeah, the self-driving cars are a great example, because nobody who didn't die will realize that for a long time statistically, but anybody who dies in a self-driving car will attract such a deep scrutiny that is probably 100 times deeper than not any fatal accident in a traditional car. So all the judgment around it and the narrative around it will be extremely and somewhat unfairly skewed towards highlighting the negative, and it will be difficult to really nurture the positive narrative until evidence becomes so overwhelming, because you just look around and people will stop dying from car accidents, and you will say, wow, this thing looks like it's working.
But what in a large system, in a populist, manipulative, algorithmic system, we're not evidence-based, right? We're fear-based. And so what you can do in a small system is, when these negative fear-based narratives emerge, you get out the secret weapon and you go and have, which is a cup of coffee, and you go and have the node in the opposite campaign, or the keep things sane. and you go and find out what their fears are, and you find out what their perspectives are, and you start to have a dialogue around what would be the self-interested things for why driverless cars should be tried for that particular person. And you start to diffuse all of those visceral white blood cell responses, but you diffuse them not by them and us, dehuman them and us, but you diffuse them by going and speaking and spending time with people and finding out what their hooks are, finding what the narratives are. So I see it as narrative labs more than anything, which is around decoding fears, but decoding fears with human relationships. And then you can scale those narratives globally, or scale those frameworks, or those safety mechanisms, or all of these things that would actually make people comfortable to do that. But what we're expecting of small jurisdictions, we're not really using them, because we see this visceral small island response or small community response, which is more amplified in some ways, and not realizing that actually the initial wall may be harder, but the time from first visceral response to adoption can be 2 years, whereas in a large country it could be 5 years. And the trick is use a small country to get to 2 years to make the large country 4 years or 3 years, because you've already got a fully working prototype where people can visit and see it operating at system scale. And so that's the principle for me.
Marc, it has been really great to chat and catch up with a coffee. And good luck for the Dandelion project, as well as to Guernsey to maintain its level and maintain its welcoming experimentation, and to proceed in being an example of human flourishing. Thank you very much for coming on Searching for the Question Live.
Thank you for having me. It's been fun.
Wonderful. So thank you very much, everybody, for following Searching for the Question Live. I hope that these conversations inspire you, as well as can be a stepping stone towards your own experiments, not only learning, but also doing, because the distance between getting inspired and being able to get into action today is really zero. That is the reason why we are always collecting the links that I am showing, and the various websites and charts and everything else, articles that come up during the conversation. You can find them at in the descriptions of the episodes. And I hope to see you at the next episode soon, with the next guest to talk about topics that impact society and communities and us as individuals. Thank you very much, and see you next time.